Michelle Ngele. For the next 2 hours, we'll be analyzing what's been making headlines in the political scene in the country for the better part of the week. We'll also be taking a look at what's making headlines in the dailies this morning. It is an interactive 2-hour show. The hashtag is Sunday Edition. Remember, you can take part in this conversation. We'll also be opening our phone lines later on to get a bit more of what you have to say. But before we get any further, let me introduce my able panel in studio this morning. And we have to my immediate right, Mutinda Kavemba, who is a political analyst. Pleasure to have you on the show, Mutinda. We also have next to him political communication expert, Hezbon Owila. Many thanks for joining us this morning. And we also have Brian Mutia, who is a governance expert as well as a law scholar. Thanks for joining us this morning, Brian. And last but not least, Dismas Mukua, who is a political risk analyst. Good to have you all in the studio this morning. And of course, we'll be taking a look at us making headlines on the dailies this morning. But before that, let's take a look at us making headlines today on the political pages. And we'll begin with a look at what's making headlines on the Sunday Standard there. And on the front page, hefty send-off for leaders as Kenyans face tough times. Of course, we've had talks of trying to reduce the public wage bill in Uhuru Kenyatta's first term in office. But we're seeing here a 3.2 billion shilling gratuity. This even as Kenyans face a rather bleak Christmas, considering the rising costs and the rather difficult economy. Dismas, considering your background in economy especially, your thoughts on how this is being handled in the country?
Well, really, there's nothing wrong in giving our MPs or governors something to take home, especially after having served. But the problem in Kenya is that when we pay our political leaders, most of the time they've not delivered. And one can easily argue that our members of the National Assembly, Senate, and even governors are poorly paid. And I know that's an issue that most people will easily roll their eyes and say that they're highly paid. But they're poorly paid, because on average an MP earns about $500,000, and that's not sufficient. We should even get a strategy of increasing their pay. However, there must be a good return on investment. In mature economies like Singapore and South Korea and Israeli, the political leadership is paid top dollar for them to deliver. But if you look at the performance of the last Senate and the last National Assembly, there's nothing to write home about. They go to the National Assembly, they spend all their time whiling away, there's no good return on investment. And maybe at some stage we should adopt a strategy whereby we pay MPs based on their output. Like for instance, as we sit right now, there's a crisis. As a nation, we have a food security crisis. Not every person is able to get a meal. Yet you had a committee responsible for agriculture in the two houses. We are still being given a beating by terrorists. Yet you had a committee at the National Assembly and the Senate in charge of defense and foreign relations. And they've not done anything. Apart from a few MPs who came up with motions or maybe bills like Sakaja, if you ask anybody in the streets whether there's an MP or a senator who has done anything to write home about, nothing. They go to the National Assembly, they become mechanical, they pass bills as given directions by President Kenyatta or the Deputy President Ruto, and absolutely nothing to write home. Now, if you compare the debates at the Kenya National Assembly and maybe in England, in the UK, the way the leaders go to the National Assembly prepared, subject matter experts, serious interrogations. Like, for instance, Michelle, there's so much corruption in Kenya, but the MPs at the National Assembly and Senate, or rather National Assembly and the Senate, they've done nothing to sort out this issue. So they just go while away. So in my concluding remarks is, let's get a strategy, pay our people very well, and expect them to perform. And if they don't perform, we send them home.
All right. Do you agree with this, Brian? Because in some countries, even as Dismas refers to them, there are some countries where public service leadership, in the National Assembly, in the Senate, is almost a volunteering job. There's not much package that comes with it. But, President Uhuru Kenyatta made it clear that he meant to reduce the load off the Kenyans' shoulders in terms of economy. Is this the right way to go?
I think I do partially agree with him on some points, and also tends to have a different view on some other quarters. I think when he says that Kenyan folk is actually lowly paid, I think that's not true, because if you compare this with other best practices, other areas, regions within Africa, for instance, Ethiopia, Australia, you realize that they do not even have so much value attached to being a member of parliament. In fact, some of them participate in this process on their own volition, as a volunteer sort of basis. And you realize that whatever they are given is just a sort of incentive just to continue being able to participate in that. But there's nothing like take-home being a Hefty one. So we have also to look into ways of how we can devalue this process, these seats, and make sure that they are not that highly, competitive, because that's why people kill literally to have a political seat. And it's the high time that we need also to look into the role of this person. Because when we talk about raising their parks, we also need to look at the nature of our economy. Is it sustainable enough to, maintain such kind of cash flow to these particular people? And also you have to look at the geographical coverage in terms of the number of political areas of representation, whether they are really whether we really need to have these big numbers of political areas of representation.
Right.
And I think there was a proposal by one, Korea Moses. He had an initial proposal that never saw the light of the day. And I don't know whether it really saw the floor of the House, where he had actually talked about merging some of these counties and also merging some of the wards and also areas of members of parliament in which they represent. And in so doing, he was actually talking about ensuring that we have a situation where at least we have little members, or half of the ones that we have in parliament being halved. So that at least the economy can be seen to be able to sustain them in a better way. But when you look at the situation right now, much of the recurrent expenditure goes to the pockets of these people. But at the end of the day, when you want to measure whether they have really performed accordingly, there's no checklist which is actually structured in a way that you can show, what you have been able to earn is actually commensurate with what you are earning. And therefore, there's a huge sort of disconnect that needs to be addressed.
Right. Hesbon, your thoughts on this, considering that when the Salaries and Remuneration Commission brought up the concept of slashing salaries of public state officers, it was seen as a move in the right direction for the Uhuru administration. Then we see this hefty take-home gratuity for governors. But even as the cabinet, takes shape in Uhuru's second term, we're hearing talk of him expanding the cabinet's laws to the maximum 22, again, increasing, the public wage bill there. Do we then need some sort of checks and balances to measure, take accountable these members of parliament for their 5-year terms?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't agree with what the Salaries Commission did just before the election, slashing their salaries. I would want to identify more with a very structured way of doing things, looking at what MPs do and the pay package that they are given. That if we are more focused on efficiency and effectiveness, it won't be so much about the salaries as it would be about what exactly they are supposed to do with a lot of efficiency and effectiveness and the amount of money that you're paying them. But I think, having said that, when you look at what is happening and the pay package that these MPs and governors and cabinet secretaries who've served in the last 5 years are being given, there's nothing wrong in that. I mean, the law is very clear that they had a pay and the gratuity is calculated on a 30%, basis of the basic salary, which means this is something that they actually earned based on the contractual agreement that they had as members of parliament, governors, deputy governors, cabinet secretaries. So we cannot take that away from them. But I think the glaring headline that we get to see at this particular time when we've had a grueling electioneering period and economic challenges that we have during the festive season, it creates a sense, that we are living in a dispensation where our leaders are wallowing in opulence while a majority of Kenyans are struggling to make an end, which, again, from a communication point of view, you'd say that is very unfortunate, that it is important that this thing is put to a wider context, that there is nothing wrong in having these people paid. This is actually something they earn. And it happens to all of us. When you work for an organization, for the government, or wherever you work, at the end of your contract, you are given gratuity, which is pegged on your basic salary. But I think whatever Dismas is saying is actually what I want to identify with more, that we need to ensure that our MPs are paid to cushion them from any other distraction that would stop them from functioning as legislators and people who oversight the executive, so that they make laws that would facilitate economic development, so that if people are paid what they really deserve, there is no quarter of this country that is complaining.
Right,
so it is not so much about the salary, it is about what exactly are they doing, you know, and partially what Brian is saying is true, that we have MPs who are going to be paid because they never made it back to Parliament, yet they did absolutely nothing. And the areas that they were representing, you ask yourself, do we need those many MPs? I've said it here before. I come from Suna East, which is a constituency, and I shop in Suna West, and I can walk to Nyatike constituency. These three constituencies are in Migori county. And needless to say, you can actually have one person represent these three constituencies.
Mutinda, the husband says paying members of parliament what they deserve. But how do we begin measuring what they deserve? I remember when the SRC began this conversation, we saw them on national television saying, I cannot earn 600,000 shillings. What are my children supposed to eat? And a majority of Kenyans thought, I mean, half of us do not even earn close to probably 100,000 shillings. But there was initially talk of, even as we try to pay members of parliament and cushion them even from engaging in corruption, stopping them or passing a legislation that ensures that members of parliament do not engage in any sort of business with the government as well. Are these some of the austerity measures then Kenyans need to see from the Uhuru administration?
I think from where I sit, I would want to look at it from the aspect of value for money. Are we getting value for money as Kenyans? Because that way then we'll be able to know whether we are on the right path or not. Because like for instance, let's take legislatures, the MPs in both houses. They have three main functions. They are there to represent us, they are there to legislate, and they are there to oversight. How effective are they in delivering on those mandates? Because if they were, then I personally would not feel any pinch for them being paid as they are paid. But the problem is when they fail on delivering on their mandate. And let's, for instance, pick one aspect of their mandate, which is oversight. The Auditor General in every year says that we lose over 300 billion to corruption. Yet the primary recipient of the Auditor General's reports is the National Assembly, Senate, and the County Assembly. So what is it that they do? That is also true of the Controller of Budget. Right. If you look at those reports, they've been implicating a lot of people, year in, year out, in doing wrong stuff. We never see anything coming out of Parliament. Yet that is how the procedure should go. That this report, once it lands there, they need to go through it, establish who are capable, and make recommendations. But nothing much has been forthcoming from both houses and even the county assemblies. That is now where we as the taxpayers need to question whether we are getting value for money. Then ask ourselves, if we are not, what is it that we can do to ensure that these people actually have no leeway not to do their job as they ought to? Let me give you an example. I'm a Nairobian, even by voting. And in the last 5 years since 2013, the Auditor General was pointing out at a problem that we had in the county of Nairobi, that was spending locally collected revenue at source, that we were in violation of Article 207 and the Public Finance Management Act, Section 119, which clearly states that all revenues first need to be deposited in the county revenue fund. That is also true of the Controller of Budget. All their reports since 2013 were talking about that. But at no point was the county government of Nairobi put to task about explaining why. And yet, year in, year out, from 2013, 2014 up to 2017, all the reports were saying that there is a problem in Nairobi City County. The locally collected revenue is not being banked. But no one was ever invited to either the county assembly or the Senate to respond to such. Now, that is the point where we start feeling like we are being cheated, because we pay these people so highly to do some of these jobs that are clearly spelled out, but we feel that they are not delivering on that. It's just that the current administration at least has now decided to be banking from what we've been getting. Right. But it was not after the intervention of any of these houses, which by law should be the first people who should be questioning why that is happening and ensuring that it does not happen. How then do you explain something like that, that is so clearly a violation of a law happening for a whole 5-year and yet we have bodies and members that are paid to ensure such things don't happen. So my concern would be, what is it that we should do? What mechanisms can we put in place to ensure that we can gauge the performance of each member of the National Assembly or the County Assembly, and also their performance collectively? Because I believe if they perform their jobs as envisaged, then we would be getting value for money.
Right.
Like, for instance, if they can be a bit tough on people explaining why the Auditor General is raising questions about what they are doing, then that would have a drastic reduction in the amounts that are being said to be lost through some of these dubious means. But year in, year out, it is almost, the figure is actually expanding. Yet we have a functional parliament.
All right.
And we have county
it seems to be
assemblies.
more of a problem or a gap in, the structural checks and balances within government. Brian, is this a governance issue, and how then do we bridge this gap and ensure we have the legitimate or correct checks and balances that we need as a people?
It's both a governance issue and a legal issue here, because as we said that members of parliament need to show what they have been able to do, and because there's no actually strong legal framework to put them into task, to be accountable to the people. That's why they can actually miss even as many times as possible in terms of attendance in the House. Right. And nobody, especially Wanjiku and the Kamau, are not able even to raise a finger on whether they are really participating fully in terms of matters of what they were sent into that House to do. But I also want to say that as my colleagues said, that we also need to ensure that we put them into task so that they can create legislative or regulations which are able to offer an environment which is conducive to produce or to give the country a lot of money that will be able also to sustain their parks when they retire. Because, for example, when I talked about the issues some time ago about the ways of doing business in Kenya. For somebody to operate or to open a new company, whether a foreigner or an individual or a citizen here, it takes quite longer than expected. It takes longer than in other countries such as Mauritius and Rwanda. And if members of parliament were able to come up with the drastic measures to ease business for foreigners and also citizens here within, it will also ensure that or resonate with more production in terms of the KRA being able to net more profits and more tax. And that will also be able to go to the exchequer so that members of parliament, when they retire, and other state officials or public officers are able to get these gratuities without putting pressures on the economy. But when the flow of the cash flow to the exchequer is very little, then the moment that you take 3.2 billion to give gratuities to these retiring officers, then you are putting a lot of pressure to the economy. And that's something that needs to be looked into as far as fiscal discipline is concerned, so that we have this kind of prudence in terms of ensuring that the amount that goes out is commensurate with the amount that comes in, and also it's able to leave the economy in a more stable way. But I also have an issue with also the kind of parliamentary system that we do have here in Kenya. Of course, being a presidential system, you realize that we have very little opportunity or legal framework which is able to put the government of the day into checks and balances, because this is a government that almost regulates itself with a weak regulation within itself, because we do not have an opposition to counter or to look into the activities. The only position which is able to offer that kind of oversight, being an opposition sort of position, is actually the minority leader, who is Bandi. Is he able to marshal enough support from the opposition to put checks and balances on the government in terms of expenditures, in terms of its fiscal prudence, and in terms of delivery from these members of our assembly? If the answer is no, then we have to look into a system where we are able to have a stronger opposition which is able to look into financial prudence, service delivery, and also ensure that members of parliament are able to, commit to deliver what is they are supposed to do. And also, You understand that, Michelle, there are some committees in Parliament, especially the Financial Committee and the Public Financial Committee and the Investment Committees. These are committees which are mandated by the law to ensure that they look into how the government operates as far as the physical discipline is concerned. And how they are able to exercise that kind of discipline is always checked through those committees. Now, if those committees, for example, are not having the muscle or the legislative muscle to do what they are permitted to do, then you find that there's a problem to put checks and the balances into other institutions which their sole mandate is to produce money for the country. And for example, the KPLC, KRA, who is able to actually meticulously look into the accounts and ensure that they are really living to that kind of financial prudence and ensure that there is cash flow towards the exchequer to sustain the works of the government. So there is a huge disconnect both as a governance issue and also as a legal issue.
All right, I'll just move away from this, but Hesbon, very briefly, just reading from what Brian says, is the opposition, as is currently constituted, able to put strict checks and balances on the government of the day?
Well, I think to a large extent, because they have nothing to lose if they put the government in check, because that is essentially their mandate to ensure that
considering the tyranny of numbers within Parliament.
Yeah, considering the tyranny of numbers. And you see, the opposition doesn't have to force the government to do anything. They just need to come out and point out that this is what is going on that is not within the law or is likely to affect our expenditure. But I think there is also a sense in which, if I want to look at it, this thing from a communication expert, you also want to appreciate what the media is doing in terms of backing when some of these things are going wrong. But you also need to be critical of what the media should do beyond just backing, that they should attend to some of these issues to conclusion, that it is not just enough to tell us that these governors and MPs are going to be paid. It's good to follow up and make it clear that there is a wider context. These guys have to be paid, and look back and tell us that we need to look back into what these guys actually did and whether you want to go on with this. Especially going forward, you look at the governance structure, the political dispensation, and you realize that the only voice that happens to be a lot more objective in all this, that cannot be compromised easily, is the media. So if the media can be a lot more constructive in terms of telling us that this county, this issue has certain problems that the public needs to attend to, they need to follow up and ensure that we know to conclusion what happens. If Nairobi County, for instance, has an issue, they need to follow up and tell us that these were the exemptions that were raised by the auditor, and this is how Nairobi responded. And there are also beautiful things that the media can also follow up on. You look at what Sakaja did as a nominated MP. He brought into the Act of Parliament a law that actually compares government agencies and the government to give 30% of the tenders to young people and women. Now, to what extent? You know, you have companies and state organizations that are looking for these young people. So to what extent is the media letting us know that these are the organizations, these are the government agencies that are not adhering to this law? So that if these organizations are brought to the public domain, then the public can hold their members of parliament accountable and tell them that, you know what, you are in parliament. Now, the leaders in these government agencies need to be brought to book to explain why this happened. And I also want to call upon, progressive minds in Parliament and the Senate like Sakaja, that information is power. They should also use the media to help young people from all over this country understand some of the things that would empower them so that they appreciate, that the economic framework that MPs are providing can also help them.
All right, so we'll be coming back.
Allow me to say something on that matter.
Very briefly.
Yes, you see, there is this notion that it is only the opposition that should be holding the government of the day to account. And that is wrong, and I think I feel dutiable to correct that, because it is about the principle of separation of powers. And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Like, for instance, if you go to Kisumu, the governor is ODM, and majority, by far, of the MCAs are also ODM. Are we trying to imply then that those people should always rubber stamp what the governor wants? No. The principle of separation of powers is very, very clear. There is the executive, there is the legislature, and there is the judiciary. The legislature should function as a unit in performing their duties. And one of the places where we go wrong, like even in Nairobi, for instance, our governor is a Jubilee, and the majority of the people there, of the MCAs, are also Jubilee. It does not mean that they always have to agree with what the governor is doing, because they have a duty as a unit to ensure that they effectively play their roles. And like I've said, one of their key roles is oversight. So it should be a matter of objectivity. Everything should be dealt with on merit, so that even if you are government aligned in terms of politics, but you're in parliament and you're seeing something that has come from the executive that is not in order, then you are duty bound to call it out and ask for accountability. That is how we are going to function. But if we go with this notion that you only question when you are not from the government, then we're going to get it wrong, because majority of the 47 counties, for instance, are such that the governor and the majority of the MCAs come from the same party. But the law expects them to effectively play their roles, irrespective of that kind of fact. So I thought that should come out.
We'll come back with this conversation. We must take a short break, but we'll be coming back with this conversation. We'll also be speaking about what's making headlines on the Sunday Nation this morning, the Raila Oath dilemma. Questions are now arising on the value and legality of this strategy, with intense pressure from supporters to swear in Raila Odinga on the 12th of December. This even as President Kenyatta says he will unite the nation. Which way to go? Sunday Edition takes a short commercial break. Stay with us. We'll continue in just a moment.